The sinuous line of the Prut River you see on the screen right now was a knife that Stalin plunged into Eastern Europe 83 years ago. But today, that knife is being forcibly pulled out. Now, the Romania-Moldova border, which the Kremlin calls its red line, is about to become history. Without a single shot fired, without a single act of force, with a single diplomatic signature, the Kremlin's Black Sea plans and European bridges are about to be wiped out overnight. Moldovan President Sandu admitted, "We cannot resist Russia alone." And the solution is on the table. One state, one flag, a new NATO border, Article 5 protection, and Moscow's Transnistria card suddenly turning into a deadly trap. At the center of this geopolitical storm lies the highly calculated and timely confession of Moldovan President Maya Sandu. By stating that it is becoming difficult to resist Russia on our own, Sandu has diplomatically admitted that Moldova's chances of surviving alone in the current geopolitical context are diminishing. Sandu's statements should not be read as a mere political wish or an example of romantic nationalism. These statements are the clearest signal that the balance of power in the region is shifting. This statement is an expression of a small state's desire to seek shelter from the approaching global storm under the umbrella of a giant shield, namely NATO and European Union member Romania. The fact that Moldovan former Prime Minister Dorin Râșan and other high-level officials also support this discourse shows that the state mind in Chisinau is evolving in this direction. The reaction of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to this development reveals the extent of the Kremlin's concern. Lavrov described this plan as the destruction of the Moldovan state and claimed that the West was opening a new front against Russia. From Moscow's perspective, Moldova's unification with Romania is not just the loss of a former Soviet republic. It also means the complete destruction of Russia's corridor of influence extending to the Balkans and Central Europe. The Kremlin is signaling that it could deploy all its hybrid warfare tools to halt this process. However, the government in Chisinau appears intent on seizing this historic opportunity, leveraging Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine and Western support.
The country to be erased from them. The Republic of Moldova, being situated between Ukraine and Romania, acts as a bridge between the Western European and Russian Eurasian world.
Another noteworthy aspect of this process is its timing. As the global system shifts from a liberal order to a realist order, entering an era where the strong survive, the luxury of neutrality is disappearing for fragile states like Moldova. The US's changing priorities regarding European security are pushing Eastern European countries to fend for themselves. Maya Sandu's move is an adaptation reflex to this new world order, a kind of state insurance initiative. Unification is on the table as the most definitive solution against Russia's possible aggression, as it would automatically bring Moldova under the protection of the EU and NATO. To understand what is happening today, it is essential to take a brief journey through the complex history of this region. For the conflict between the map in Putin's mind and the reality on the ground has its roots here. The process that began in 1812 with the Russian Empire's annexation of Bessarabia shaped the region's destiny for 2 centuries. Tsarist Russia detached the region from the Ottoman Empire, incorporated it into its sphere of influence, and began demographic engineering there. However, in 1918, amid the chaos of World War I, Bessarabia united with Romania, realizing the ideal of a greater Romania. This period is referred to as the Golden Age by those in Bucharest and Chisinau who favor unification today. However, the wheel of history turned once again in 1940. Under the secret provisions of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed between Soviet Russia and Germany, the Soviet Union reoccupied the region and established the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Soviet regime imposed the Cyrillic alphabet to sever ties with Romania and attempted to construct an artificial language and identity called Moldovan. The status quo that Putin is trying to preserve today is actually based on the borders drawn by Stalin in 1940 and the identity construct he created. The current rapprochement between Romania and Moldova is an attempt to revive the spirit of 1918 and destroy Stalin's legacy. Gaining independence in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moldova has been caught between an identity crisis and geopolitical realities ever since. The idea of unification, which first came to the fore during the presidency of Mircea Snega, was shelved due to pressure from Moscow and Romania's internal problems at the time. However, history is repeating itself, and an unfinished process is reaching its completion stage. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reopened this historical wound, but it has also opened a window of opportunity for healing. Today's single-state project is not just a border change, but could be the final scene in a 200-year struggle between Russia and the West. Behind the diplomatic headlines, there is an area where unification has actually begun, but has been overlooked by many: energy. Although unification has not yet been signed on paper, it has already taken place in pipelines and power grids. This means that Russia's biggest asset in the region, its energy weapon, has been taken away, and Gazprom's influence has collapsed. For years, Russia has kept Moldova dependent on it, with promises of cheap gas, and used this dependency as a tool for political blackmail. The crises of 2021 and 2022, in particular, were the culmination of Moscow's strategy of bringing Chisinau to its knees by leaving it in the cold. However, this strategy backfired when it encountered unexpected resistance and a creative solution. The Moldovan government began to secure its energy security through Bucharest by accelerating integration with Romania. The transfer of the operation of strategic infrastructure such as Vestmoldtransgaz to Romanian companies effectively ended Russia's control over the energy distribution network within Moldova. Now Moldova's lights are lit not by Moscow turning on the taps, but by Bucharest flipping the switches. This situation means Russia has lost its strategic vision and capacity for pressure. The future of free Russian gas to the Transnistria region is also uncertain in this new equation. If Moldova fully integrates its energy lines with the West, the separatist region's economy could suddenly come to a standstill. The construction of electricity interconnection lines and the diversification of gas supply routes have removed Moldova from Russia's orbit and connected it to Europe's energy map. This is a move that breaks Russia's technological and infrastructural asymmetry. Gazprom's loss of market share is not only an economic loss, but also a break in the Kremlin's political leverage. Energy integration is a trial run for political unification, and success in this area will encourage unification steps in other areas. The most critical and dangerous aspect of the single-state scenario is undoubtedly the Transnistria issue. This separatist region, where Russia has maintained military units under the guise of a peacekeeping force since 1992, could turn from a source of strength for the Kremlin into a strategic nightmare in the event of a possible unification. A glance at the map reveals that if Moldova unites with Romania and becomes NATO territory, the Russian garrison in Transnistria will become an island, an enclave completely surrounded by NATO and Ukrainian forces. This situation is, in military literature, a classic trapped scenario. While the logistical supply of Russian troops is already difficult to maintain, in such a scenario, their complete isolation by air and land would be inevitable. The massive Soviet ammunition depots in Kubazna would cease to be a force multiplier for Russia and instead become an impossible-to-protect risk factor. Chisinau and Bucharest will have strengthened their hand to resolve Transnistria's status within the framework of international law, while Moscow will face an impossible choice between withdrawing its troops or leaving them to rot in isolation. This situation could spell the failure of Russia's frozen conflict strategy. It is reported that the Transnistrian leadership is deeply concerned about this scenario and is continuing its economic negotiations with Chisinau behind the scenes. Cutting off Russia's access to the region would make it impossible for the separatist regime to survive economically and politically. This situation could cause the oligarchic structure in the region to choose to make a deal with Europe instead of Moscow. In other words, Transnistria, seen as Russia's stronghold, could suddenly slip out of the Kremlin's control and come under Western control. This would be a difficult loss of prestige for Putin to accept. It would be a big mistake to view this rapprochement between Moldova and Romania as merely an internal matter for the two countries. The secret and most important third partner in this equation is Ukraine. Russia's 2022 invasion attempt was the main catalyst for the idea of unification in Moldova to transform from a marginal view to a matter of national security. While support for unification was at around 20% before the war, this figure quickly rose to 40% when Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border. Fear has radically changed political preferences. For Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the Kiev administration, Moldova's unification with Romania represents a strategic breathing space. This scenario is particularly vital for the security of Odessa. Russia's plan since the beginning of the war to encircle Odessa from behind via Transnistria will be thwarted by Moldova joining NATO. Ukraine's southwestern flank will be secured, and the Russian threat to the grain corridor will diminish. For this reason, Kiev, Chisinau, and Bucharest are quietly but resolutely supporting this process. A united Romania-Moldova will also strengthen Ukraine's logistical links with Europe and break Russia's encirclement in the Black Sea. At NATO headquarters, this scenario could be considered the softest and least costly way for the alliance to expand eastward. Instead of dealing with years of membership action plans, bureaucratic hurdles, and Russia's direct veto to make Moldova a member, Moldova becoming part of a state that is already a member could complete the process overnight. This is similar to the German model, East Germany automatically becoming NATO territory by uniting with West Germany. If this happens, Moldovan territory would automatically fall under the protection of NATO's Article 5. In other words, an attack on Chisinau would be considered an attack on Bucharest, Berlin, and Washington. For Russia, this would mean crossing an insurmountable red line. The Kremlin will present this as an aggressive expansion by NATO and will mobilize its propaganda machine in this direction. However, the actual situation severely limits Russia's military options. Unable to risk a direct conflict with NATO, Moscow may find itself helpless in the face of this strategic strangulation move. Of course, this scenario is not a bed of roses. Russia is waging an intense hybrid war to win the war it lost on the battlefield, in the minds of the people. While 56% of the Romanian people support unification, this percentage is lower in Moldova, and society is deeply polarized. Russian propaganda is promoting the arguments that unification will destroy Moldova's identity, turn the country into Romania's backyard, and drag it into war. The Gagauz autonomous region in particular stands out as the softest underbelly that Russia can exploit. Gagauz leaders have stated that if Moldova unites with Romania, they will exercise their right to self-determination and declare independence. This situation could create a risk of chaos and internal conflict in the country. Moscow's goal is to sabotage the unification process by creating an internal front collapse within Moldova. The Sandu government is trying to counterbalance this risk with promises of EU integration and economic prosperity. Putting the referendum card on the table is actually aimed at taking away Russia's argument that the will of the people is being ignored. Sandu is challenging Russia's autocracy with democracy. The Gagauz Turks factor makes Turkey an important actor in this equation. Ankara's good relations with Romania and its influence over the Gagauz could play a key role in resolving the crisis. Turkey's intervention as a balancing force against Russia's provocations could keep tensions in the region at a manageable level. However, the risks remain very high, and the Kremlin's divide-and-rule tactics could turn a spark into a fire at any moment. Looking at the big picture, the possible unification of Romania and Moldova would mean the construction of a massive NATO fortress in the northwest of the Black Sea. This new geopolitical structure could permanently cut off Russia's access to the Balkans and the Danube River basin. While Putin is melting his army to take villages in eastern Ukraine, he faces the strategic danger of losing all of Eastern Europe and Black Sea dominance. This is tactical successes turning into a strategic, devastated tableau. A potential single state would fill the power vacuum in the region, eliminate grey areas, and narrow Russia's hybrid operation space. This process will be painful, risky, and challenging. However, the status quo is no longer sustainable. As the world changes, expecting maps to remain static would be naive. Sandu's bold move is an example of leadership that accepts the inevitability of this change. In conclusion, Maps are drawn with ink, but throughout history, they have been changed with blood. Maya Sandu and the Bucharest administration seem to have chosen to change the map this time with ink and the will of the people, without bloodshed. Putin, however, still insists on the methods of the old world, namely blood. But if this silent revolution on both sides of the Prut River succeeds, Russia's sun in the west may set never to rise again. The "no place is safe" doctrine has now become applicable to Russia's spheres of influence. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments.